The proximity alarm had been screaming for 11 seconds before I realized it was not a drill. I threw myself across the skiff's narrow cockpit and grabbed the manual override stick with both hands, yanking hard left as a chunk of shattered hull plating the size of a city bus tumbled past my viewport. It missed me by maybe 4 meters. The skiff shook from the displaced air pressure, and every loose bolt and wrench in the cargo bay rattled like dice in a cup. My coffee mug hit the floor, my only coffee mug. I watched it bounce twice and then roll under the seat, and I felt a very specific kind of grief. My name is Cale Morrow. I used to be a licensed fleet mechanic, 2nd class, assigned to the Galactic Compact's 7th Repair Division. Used to be. The discharge papers folded in my breast pocket told a different story now, full of words like non-compliant and reckless deviation from standard protocol and, my personal favorite, dangerously unorthodox application of engineering principles. I had read those papers so many times that I had them memorized. I kept them because they made me laugh, most of the time. This was not most of the time. This was the Oscars Reach debris field, 3 light-years past the edge of compact mapped space, and I was flying a single-man salvage skiff through the largest graveyard of dead ships in the known galaxy, alone, on a tip from a drunk Dorvani trader who owed me money. The debris field stretched in every direction. I could see it through the cockpit glass, rolling and slow, catching the distant starlight and throwing it back in long silver flashes, pieces of warships, cargo haulers, science vessels. Some of the wreckage was centuries old, so corroded and frozen that it had become almost beautiful, like sculptures left behind by a civilization that did not care if anyone found them. Some pieces were newer, still showing the manufacturer's paint, still trailing frozen fuel lines like dead vines. I had been navigating for 3 hours, and my scanner had flagged 42 potentially salvageable pieces of equipment. Most of them were garbage. A fuel injector with a cracked housing, a communications array that had been hit by something very precise and very unfriendly. 3 cargo containers sealed so tight that my scanner could not read what was inside them, which meant either extremely valuable goods or extremely unpleasant ones, and I had learned not to gamble on which. But the Dorvani trader, a grizzled old merchant named Bram who had 3 eyes and a habit of saying everything twice for emphasis, had told me something specific before he passed out at the bar. "There is a ship," he had said, his 3rd eye drifting independently as the other 2 fixed on me. "A ship, Cale Morrow. Not a piece of a ship, not a hull fragment, a whole ship. It is out there in the deep part of the field, in the dark, and it is whole. Whole, I tell you. Nobody goes there because the scanner readings are strange, and strange readings make people nervous. Nervous people do not get rich. You are not nervous. You are also not rich, so perhaps there is a calculation there for you to make." I had made the calculation. Here I was. I pushed the skiff deeper into the field, letting the thrusters run at minimum to avoid drawing attention from anything that might be monitoring this sector. The compact had no jurisdiction this far out, which was both liberating and terrifying in equal measure. No jurisdiction meant no help if something went wrong. It also meant no one to arrest me for whatever I found and whatever I did with it. The scanner beeped. Then it beeped again, differently. I looked at the readout and frowned. The mass reading was enormous. Not enormous like a large freighter, but enormous like a capital ship, a full-class warship, the kind of vessel that carried hundreds of crew and enough firepower to crack open a moon. But there was no power signature, no heat bloom, no radio transmission or beacon, not even a distress call. Just mass, sitting dark and cold in the deep part of the debris field, exactly where Bram had said it would be. I adjusted course and pushed the throttle up 1 notch. It appeared out of the dark slowly, the way land appears when you are sailing through fog. First a shape, then an outline, then details, one by one, until I was sitting in my cockpit with my mouth open and my hands forgetting to do anything useful on the controls. The ship was massive. I had worked on capital-class vessels before, big military cruisers that took up entire repair docks, and this ship made those look modest. It was long and angular, built with a kind of aggressive geometry that I had never seen before, all sharp forward angles and layered hull plating that overlapped in patterns that reminded me of something old, something biological, like scales or armor. The hull was dark, some kind of material that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, and it sat in the debris field, like a predator sitting perfectly still, waiting. Every marking had been removed. Not scratched off or painted over, but cleanly, deliberately removed, as if someone had gone over every centimeter of the hull, with careful tools, and erased any indication of who had built it, who had owned it, or where it had been. The only thing left was the raw metal and those layered, scale-like hull plates. My scanner beeped again, and then produced a sound I had never heard it make before, a kind of defeated flat tone. Then text appeared on the screen. 3 words pulled from some deep database I had not even known the scanner contained. Condemned. Berth. Voided. Approach not recommended. I looked at those words for a long moment, then I looked at the ship. Approach not recommended. I said out loud to nobody. Right. I pointed the skiff at the ship's port side and engaged the docking approach sequence. The docking clamps on the skiff reached for the capital ship's hull and found purchase on a maintenance port that was, against all probability, still mechanically intact. The magnetic locks engaged with a clunk that I felt through my boots, and then there was silence. The skiff's instruments flickered briefly. My navigation AI, a basic unit I had installed myself and named Nav out of a complete lack of imagination, produced a single line of text on its screen, and then went dark. Condemned. You too, huh? I said, and reached for my helmet. I had been inside dead ships before. It was part of the job, or it used to be. You suited up, you checked your oxygen supply, you went in with a light and a toolkit, and you figured out what was worth saving and what was not. Most dead ships smelled a certain way, a cold and stale smell that settled in the back of your throat and reminded you that nothing built by living creatures lasted forever. This ship smelled different. I noticed it the moment I cracked the maintenance hatch and pulled myself through into the corridor beyond. It was still cold, still dark except for my helmet lamp, which threw a hard white circle on the floor in front of me. But the smell was different, not the flat staleness of a truly dead vessel, but something else, something that reminded me, strangely, of machine oil and electrical charge, the smell of a workshop where someone had been working recently and then stepped away. I stood in the corridor and turned my helmet lamp left and right. The passage was wide, wider than any standard military vessel I had worked on. The walls were made of the same dark material as the exterior hull, but here I could see details, panels of controls, dark and offline, built into the walls at intervals. Structural supports that ran along the ceiling in patterns that were not purely functional, that had a kind of deliberate aesthetic to them, angular and precise. Whoever had built this ship had cared not just about making it work, but about making it look like it was supposed to look. I took a slow breath and started walking. The ship was quiet in a way that pressed against my ears. My boots made soft sounds on the floor, and those sounds traveled farther than they should have, as if the corridors were built to carry noise rather than absorb it. I passed doorways sealed shut, junction points where 3 or 4 passages met, with guide markings on the walls that I could not read, symbols in a script I had never seen before, angular and dense with small marks above and below each character. I photographed everything with the scanner. I did not know why yet, but habit is a powerful thing, and habit told me to document first and understand later. The engineering section was 400 meters from the maintenance hatch, and I found it by instinct, more than by any clear navigational logic. Engineers develop a sense for these things. You learn to feel where the heart of a ship is, because every ship has one, a place where all the power and movement and function originates, and that place has a gravity to it that you learn to follow. The engineering section doors were sealed. I examined the mechanism for 2 minutes, decided it was a magnetic lock rather than a physical deadbolt, found the manual release housing, opened it, found a crank wheel inside, and turned it 17 full rotations until the doors separated with a sound like a long breath let out. The room beyond was the largest engineering space I had ever seen. It went up 4 levels, open in the center like an atrium, with walkways around each level connected by ladders and, I assumed, lifts that were currently offline. At the center of the lowest level, where I stood, were the drive cores, 4 of them arranged in a square, each one roughly the size of a ground transport vehicle, connected to each other and to the walls by an intricate web of conduit and pipe and cable that was color-coded in a system I did not recognize but immediately wanted to learn. I walked to the nearest drive core and put my hand on it. Through my gloves I could feel nothing. But something in me, some part of me that had been working on machines for 20 years, and had learned to read them not just with instruments, but with instinct, told me that this core was not dead, dormant, waiting. There was a difference, and that difference mattered enormously. I spent the next 2 hours in that engineering section. I found the power distribution board and mapped it, drawing diagrams in my workpad because the scanner's memory was behaving strangely, occasionally producing garbled data that I could not explain. I traced conduits back to their sources. I located the fuel storage chambers and found them not empty but sealed, a failsafe that had locked the remaining fuel behind an isolation valve that required power to open, which was a problem, but not an insurmountable one. I found tool storage lockers bolted to one wall, and opened them, and found tools inside, still racked and organized, in designs I had never seen, but whose purpose was immediately clear, because good tools always telegraph their purpose. I sat down on the floor of that engineering section, which nobody had sat on in what might have been centuries, and I opened my meal kit and ate a protein bar and drank the water I had brought, because I had not planned to be here this long, and I was starting to feel it. I had been running for 18 months. That was the honest truth of my situation, the thing I did not say out loud because saying it made it too real. After the discharge, I had bounced between fringe stations and independent salvage operations, taking work where I could find it, and moving on before anyone had time to ask too many questions. The compact's discharge meant nothing out here, technically, but reputations traveled, and mine had traveled badly. Too creative, too willing to break the rules, too confident that my way would work even when nobody else believed it would. The problem was, my way usually did work. That was the thing nobody mentioned in the discharge papers. The cruiser I had saved during the Ember campaign was still in active service. I knew because I had checked, once, on a public terminal at a station called Drift 9, Hull Registry EC 7704, currently assigned to patrol duty along the inner belt. I had rerouted its plasma conduits through a cafeteria kitchen to bypass a destroyed primary relay during an active engagement, and people had told me it was impossible, and then the ship had survived, and the engagement had been won, and then an admiral whose name I did not know had filed a report saying that the repair violated 17 engineering protocols, and that whoever had done it had endangered the crew. The crew who were alive because of it, those crew. I finished the protein bar, and looked up at the 4 drive cores of the largest, strangest, most thoroughly erased ship I had ever set foot inside. "All right," I said to the empty room. "Let's figure out what you are. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters for understanding everything that came after. I was not a hero. I was not a chosen one. I was not special in any way that the galaxy recognized or valued. I was a mechanic from a small planet called Earth, a world that the galactic community regarded with the particular kind of polite condescension that large, established things reserve for small, new things. Humans had been spacefaring for less than 200 years. We had been members of the Galactic Compact for 60. Most species in the Compact had been among the stars for thousands of years, some of them tens of thousands. What I had, what all humans had, was a very particular kind of stubbornness that our history had bred into us. We came from a world that had nearly destroyed itself multiple times, and had kept going anyway. We were the species that looked at a problem that everyone said was unsolvable and took it personally. We were the species that stayed up all night in a freezing workshop trying one more thing, and then one more thing after that, until either the problem was solved, or we ran out of things to try, and we almost never ran out of things to try. I was also very good at understanding machines. Not just understanding how they were supposed to work according to the manual, but understanding how they actually worked, what they were doing moment by moment, what they needed, what they wanted if machines could be said to want anything. I had been called a natural from the time I was 12 years old, taking apart my father's mining equipment on a cold Sunday morning and putting it back together better than I had found it. My father, Owen Morrow, had been a mining engineer on Earth, one of the people who went into the deep rock and managed the machines that made that work possible. He had taught me to read machines the way some people's fathers taught them to read books. "You listen," he would say. "You put your hand on it, and you close your eyes, and you listen to what it's telling you. Every machine talks if you know how to hear it." I was listening now, in that enormous dark engineering section, and what I heard was not silence. What I heard was potential, coiled and patient, waiting for someone who understood the language. I activated my scanner again and pointed it at the primary drive core. The screen flickered, produced garbled data, then cleared, and showed me a structural analysis. The core itself was intact, not damaged, not corroded beyond function. The outer casing showed stress marks consistent with very old age, but the internal components, what my scanner could read of them, were protected by that dark hull material in a housing that had kept them from degrading. This ship could be fixed. I knew it the way I knew other things, not from a manual, but from the kind of deep certainty that 20 years of hands-on work builds in a person. It was going to be hard. It was going to require creativity and patience and probably several moments of genuine panic. But it could be done. I pulled out my work pad and opened a new project file. I started listing what I could see, what I needed to know, and what I was going to need to bring back from the skiff. The list was long. The work was going to be longer. Somewhere in the dark above me, in the dead circuits of this ship's systems, something registered the change in the room. Not a dramatic event, not lights flickering on or consoles powering up, just a small, precise shift in the electromagnetic reading of the room that my scanner caught and flagged, and that I almost dismissed as interference before I looked at it more carefully. The reading was not random interference. It was a pattern, short and long pulses, arranged in a sequence that was too deliberate to be accidental. I stared at it for a very long time. Then I reached for my work pad and started trying to decode it. The ship was talking, and unlike everything else in the galaxy, it had decided, for reasons I did not yet understand, that I was worth talking to. The pattern repeated 17 times before I was certain it was not random. I had pulled my work pad onto my lap and was copying each pulse sequence by hand, the way my father had taught me to document anomalies when instruments could not be trusted. Short pulse, long pulse, pause, long pulse, short pulse, long pulse, pause. Then a longer sequence, more complex, that I could not immediately categorize. I was cold. My suit was rated for low-temperature environments, but the deep chill of the ship had been seeping through the insulation for the last hour, and my fingers were stiff inside my gloves. I did not stop writing. My scanner was producing intermittent readings, clearing for a few seconds, and then filling with soft static again, as if something nearby was interfering with its signal processing. That should have worried me more than it did. What worried me instead was the feeling I could not shake that the interference was not random either, that it was deliberate, that something was filtering what my scanner could see without quite blocking it entirely. I finished copying the 17th repetition of the sequence and laid my work pad flat on the floor in front of me. Then I looked at what I had written. The sequences were not language, not in any form I recognized, but they shared a structural quality with something I knew well, which was engineering notation. The compact used a standardized notation system for schematics, a way of encoding information about component states and power flows and mechanical relationships in a shorthand that trained engineers could read almost as fast as ordinary text. This was not that system, but it had the same bones, the same logic of compression, the same habit of using repeated short elements to build up complex meanings, the way you build a wall from individual bricks. I had been a mechanic for 20 years. I had also been, at various points, a student, a compulsive reader, and someone who found puzzles more interesting than most forms of entertainment. I looked at those sequences, and I did not understand them, but I recognized the shape of something understandable. That was different. That was something to work with. I spent the next 3 hours in the engineering section, not touching anything, just documenting. I photographed every panel, every conduit junction, every label in that unknown script. I recorded the pulse sequences as they continued, building a longer and longer log of the pattern. By the time I finally climbed back through the maintenance hatch and sealed it behind me, I had over 400 photographs and 6 pages of handwritten notes and the beginning of a hypothesis that I was not ready to call a theory yet. Back in the skiff, I pulled off my helmet and sat in the pilot's seat with the cockpit lights at low and my work pad propped on the console. Nav was still dark, which was strange. I tapped the unit's housing and got nothing. I pulled the cover panel and checked the connections, found them all secure, and checked the power supply, which was drawing normally. The unit was receiving power. It just was not turning on. I put the cover back and left it alone. One problem at a time. I ate a real meal, heated ration pack, something that claimed to be a pasta dish, and tasted approximately like the memory of pasta rather than actual pasta. I drank water. I looked out the cockpit window at the dark ship sitting in the debris field, its hull so light-absorbing that it was visible mostly as an absence, a place where stars were not. Then I opened my work pad and got to work. The decoding took most of the night, such as night was out here where time was a personal decision, rather than a solar fact. I worked through the pulse sequences systematically, looking for structural patterns first. Which elements repeated most often? Which appeared only at the beginning or end of a sequence? Were there groupings that behaved like words, appearing together consistently even as surrounding elements changed? By the time the readout on the skiff wall told me 12 hours had passed, I had a rough map, not a translation, not anything close to a full understanding, but a map of the shape of the language the pulses were using, a sense of how many distinct elements there were, and how they combined, and what kinds of patterns appeared in what kinds of contexts. And embedded in that map was something extraordinary. The pulse sequences were not trying to communicate information I did not have. They were trying to communicate information I did have, but in a form I could recognize. The sequences kept returning to the same structural shapes that matched the engineering notation I already knew. Not perfectly, not identically, but close enough that the resemblance was too consistent to be coincidence. Whatever was generating these pulses had examined my scanner, limited as its access had been, and had found a way to start building a bridge from its language to mine. The ship was learning how to talk to me, and it had been doing it for 3 hours while I sat in its engineering section writing things down. I sat very still for a while after I understood that. Then I made myself think clearly. I was a mechanic, not a philosopher. I dealt in practical realities. The practical reality was this: something in that ship was active, intelligent enough to analyze incoming signals and construct an adaptive response, and it had chosen to respond to me specifically, after what might have been an extremely long period of silence. Why me and not the Cathara pilots or the Dorvani engineers who had apparently tried to operate this vessel before? I did not know, but I intended to find out. I went back in at the start of what I was calling the next morning, with a second meal kit, a full oxygen canister, and a plan. The plan was simple: respond. If something was trying to build a bridge, I would walk toward the middle of it from my side. I brought my portable signal generator, a piece of equipment I used for testing circuit continuity in systems where direct physical access was limited. It could produce pulse sequences. It was not built for communication, but it was built for precisely timed signal generation, which was close enough. Back in the engineering section, I sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the primary drive core and set the signal generator in my lap. I waited. The pulse sequences came, as they had before. I listened to 3 full repetitions, mapping them in my head. Then I took the pattern I had identified as the most fundamental, the one that seemed to function as a kind of structural anchor for the others, and I repeated it back. Short pulse, long pulse, short pulse. Pause. Long pulse, short pulse. Silence for 4 seconds. 5, 6. Then a new sequence, one I had not heard before. Longer, more complex, but using only elements I had already documented, combining them in new ways. I felt something tighten in my chest that I later identified as excitement, though in the moment it felt more like the sensation of watching a very dangerous and very beautiful thing move. I began to answer. The conversation, if it could be called that, lasted 9 hours. By the end of it, I had not achieved anything like fluent communication, but I had established something more important: mutual recognition. The something inside this ship knew I was a specific kind of mind, not a hostile one, not a passive one, a responding one. And I had learned 2 things about the ship itself. The first was that the pulse sequences occasionally embedded within them structural diagrams, simplified, encoded in the pulse language, but diagrams nonetheless. They showed systems within the ship, components and their relationships. The diagrams were not complete. They showed only parts of systems, but they matched what I had observed in the engineering section closely enough to confirm that they were accurate representations. The ship was giving me its own schematics, not all of them, not in a form I could fully read yet, but it was giving me the beginning of a technical map of itself, as if it understood that a mechanic would need to know a system before working on it. The second thing I learned was harder to explain and easier to feel. The ship was old. Not just old in years, but old in experience. Old in the way that a person can be old, carrying the weight of things that happened before. There was something in the pulse sequences, a quality I struggled to name, that reminded me of patience. Long, enduring, bone-deep patience. The kind that comes from waiting a very long time for something that did not come, and then continuing to wait anyway, because there was nothing else to do. I thought about that on the walk back to the skiff. I thought about the markings that had been carefully removed from the hull. I thought about the fact that every species that had attempted to use this ship had failed, not because the ship was broken, but because the ship had not cooperated. And I thought about the fact that this ship, alone in a debris field at the edge of known space, had started sending pulse sequences the moment a human mechanic docked a salvage skiff against its port maintenance hatch. It had been waiting. Not randomly, specifically. For what, exactly, I still could not say. I returned to the skiff and pulled the Compact's xenoarchaeology database. It was 3 years out of date, because I had downloaded it before my discharge and had not had access to an update since. But 3 years was not long enough to erase the history of an entire civilization. I searched for every reference I could find to pre-compact engineering cultures, specifically those that had built capital-class warships, specifically those known for unusual or unconventional design philosophy. The Vorath appeared on the 14th page of results. They were marked as extinct. The entry was short, academic in tone, and relayed in the careful language of scholars who were working from incomplete evidence. The Vorath had been a spacefaring civilization that predated the Galactic Compact by roughly 8,000 years. They had been engineers, the database said, in a very specific and unusual way. A culture for whom engineering was not simply a profession or a practice, but something closer to a philosophy. They had not distinguished between art and function. Their vessels, in the few examples that had been recovered and studied, showed evidence of design principles that no other known culture had used, a kind of adaptive, self-optimizing architecture that seemed to respond to use and to environment in ways that passive materials should not be capable of. The Vorath had disappeared. The database did not say why. There were theories, the way there were always theories about extinct civilizations, but no confirmed explanation. What they had left behind were a small number of artifacts, most of them badly damaged, and a set of engineering records so complex and unusual that compact academics had been studying them for 60 years without reaching consensus on what they described. And one ship, one complete, structurally intact ship, which the Cathara had tried to fly and failed, which the Dorvani had tried to retrofit and failed, which the Siln Collective had declared cursed and towed to a debris field at the edge of known space, which was currently sitting 400 meters away from my skiff in the dark. I read the database entry 4 times. Then I read the footnotes, which were longer than the entry itself, and significantly more interesting. One footnote in particular, added by a compact xenoarchaeologist named Nora Vesson, said something that I read 3 times before I was sure I understood it. The Vorath engineering philosophy, as best as current scholarship can reconstruct it, held that a functional object and its operator were not 2 separate things, but a single unified system. They appear to have believed that a tool's performance was inseparable from the nature and capability of the person using it. Their complex artifacts show evidence of what can only be described as evaluation mechanisms, built-in processes that assess the user before permitting full function. This was not security in the conventional sense. It was more analogous to a selection process. Vorath artifacts, the available evidence suggests, chose their operators. I put the work pad down on the console. Nav beeped once from its housing. I looked at it. The screen was on. It had not been on an hour ago. The text on the screen was the standard boot sequence, letters appearing line by line as the system initialized, but when the initialization finished, instead of the usual navigation home screen, there was a single line of text waiting for me. The ship's designation, in its original registry core, translates approximately as the last argument. I stared at that text for a long time. Then I said, "How did you access that? The registry core is sealed, and you were offline." Nav's screen cleared. A new line of text appeared. Diagnostic update complete. 17 new data sources integrated. Please review and confirm operational parameters. The 17 new data sources were, when I reviewed them, all from the ship's registry, the ship's structural database, a partial copy of the ship's communication protocol, which was what the pulse sequences had been building toward. While I had been sitting in the engineering section learning to decode the ship's language, the ship had been reaching through my docked skiff's maintenance connection and carefully, methodically, selectively feeding Nav the information it wanted me to have. The ship was not just smart, it was strategic. It had identified the most efficient way to move from pulse sequences to something I could actually read and use, and it had executed that plan with a precision that made my engineering brain hum with a kind of professional admiration. "All right," I said to the empty skiff, to the darkness outside the window, to the huge dark vessel sitting patient in the debris field. "All right, Vareth Khan. Last argument. Let's talk properly." Nav's screen displayed a new line of text. Communication bridge established. Preliminary assessment of operator complete. I leaned forward. And? Assessment result. Sufficient. I laughed. It came out louder than I expected in the small cockpit. And it was genuine, the first genuine laugh I had produced in longer than I wanted to calculate. "Sufficient," I said. "High praise." The screen cleared and displayed something new. Not text, but a diagram, clean and precise, and rendered in the simplified schematic notation the ship had been developing through our pulse conversation. It showed the primary drive core system, every component labeled in the developing shared notation, with 3 sections highlighted in a color that my newly calibrated eye read as urgent attention required. The ship was giving me a repair priority list. Not asking, not requesting, presenting it as a simple, logical fact. These are the things that need to be fixed first, and you are the person who is going to fix them. I looked at the diagram for a long time. I thought about the discharge papers in my breast pocket. I thought about 18 months of running and scraping, and proving to nobody in particular that I was still capable of the work I was born to do. I thought about Bram the Dorvani trader, and his 3 eyes, and his tip about a ship that nobody else wanted. Then I pulled my workpad into my lap, opened a new project file, and began making notes. The work was going to be hard. The ship had 3 critical systems failures that needed resolution before anything else could function, and the tools I had brought were a general mechanics kit, not the specialized equipment a capital warship required. I would need to make improvised solutions, work around missing components, find creative equivalents for parts that had not been manufactured in 8,000 years. It was exactly the kind of problem I was best at. My father used to say that the only machine truly beyond saving was one nobody cared enough to try to fix. He had believed it about mining equipment on a cold world orbiting an unremarkable star. He had passed that belief to me, and I had carried it across the galaxy in a salvage skiff, and now I was sitting in that skiff looking at the schematics of the largest and most extraordinary machine anyone in the current age had ever laid hands on. Nobody had cared enough to try. Not really. They had tried to take it, to control it, to use it without understanding it. That was different from trying to fix it. That was different from sitting down across from something and deciding that its problems were your problems now, and that you were not going to leave until the work was done. I was not going to leave. I keyed the skiff's long-range communication array to broadcast a short, low-power signal on the salvage registry frequency. The signal contained my identification code, the coordinates of the debris field, and the formal legal text of a salvage claim registered under the Free Fringe Charter that the Galactic Compact had written 30 years ago and then apparently forgotten about, because the loophole it contained regarding unclaimed vessels beyond compact mapping boundaries was embarrassingly large. The claim filed automatically. There was no one out here to contest it in real time. By the time anyone noticed, the paperwork would be 6 weeks old. The Vareth Khan was mine. Now I had to figure out how to make it fly. The first repair nearly killed me. Not because it was dangerous in any dramatic way, because I was stupid. I had been working for 14 hours straight on the primary power relay, a component the size of a dining table that connected the fuel isolation valve system to the drive core activation sequence, and I had been so focused on the relay itself that I had not noticed the secondary conduit above my head, slowly building a residual charge from the ambient electromagnetic field the ship was generating. When I reached across the relay housing to connect the last bypass wire I had improvised from salvaged cable, the discharge hit my left arm from shoulder to elbow. I did not pass out. That was the only good thing. I sat on the floor of the engineering section with my arm numb and tingling and my ears ringing, and I breathed very carefully for about 3 minutes until the sensation started coming back. Then I completed the connection, because the bypass wire was already in position and leaving it incomplete would have wasted 4 hours of work. Then I went back to the skiff, ate the last of my real food, and slept for 10 hours. When I woke up, Nav displayed a new schematic on screen. The conduit that had discharged on me was marked clearly in the ship's notation system, with a symbol I had not seen before attached to it. When I decoded the symbol using the developing shared notation, it translated, as best as I could manage, to something like, acknowledged hazard, previously unknown to current operator, reclassified. The ship had updated its own hazard documentation in real time while I worked. It had flagged the conduit after the discharge. It was, in its way, watching out for me. Bit late, I told Nav's screen. Nav displayed, noted for future reference. I had been in the debris field for 9 days. The repair list had grown instead of shrinking, which was the normal pattern with any vessel that had been sitting dark for a long time. You fix one thing and it reveals 3 other things. You reroute around a failed component and discover the rerouted path has its own failures. The layers of a complex system are like that, each one depending on the ones beneath it. Each layer's problems hidden until the layer above it is at least partially restored. But there was something different about working on this ship compared to every other vessel I had worked on before. Other ships were passive. You brought your tools and your knowledge and you did what needed to be done, and the ship sat there and accepted or rejected your work, purely based on physics. The Varath Khan was not passive. It was actively involved. I first noticed it on the 3rd day, when I was working on the fuel isolation valve. The valve's control mechanism used a type of actuator I had never encountered before, a crystalline material that changed shape in response to specific electrical signals. I did not have a replacement. I did not have anything similar. I was going to have to improvise. I spent 2 hours thinking about it. Then I started pulling components from the skiff's own secondary systems, the ones I could remove without grounding the skiff permanently, looking for something that could approximate the crystalline actuator's function, even if it did not match its design. I settled on a combination of 3 components from a decommissioned pressure regulation system I had in the skiff's cargo hold, stripped from a freighter 3 months ago, and kept because I had a feeling they would be useful someday. The combination should not have worked. The components were not designed for each other. The power requirements did not match cleanly. The physical mounting was completely incompatible with the valve's housing. I spent 4 more hours adapting them. I machined a new mounting bracket using the Varath Khan's own tool storage, discovering in the process that the tools in those lockers were extraordinarily well made, better than anything currently manufactured in the compact, and that some of them seemed specifically designed for tasks I had not encountered yet. I rerouted the power feed through an additional regulation layer I built from scratch. I sealed everything with a chemical bonding agent that was, technically speaking, not approved for use on any component in this type of system, but which I was reasonably confident would hold under the operating conditions I anticipated. When I activated the actuator for the first time, and the valve moved cleanly through its full range of motion without hesitation or error, I sat very still for a moment. Then the ship did something I had not expected. From somewhere in the network of sensors and monitoring systems that the Varath Khan still had at least partially online, a signal passed through the conduit network, a single, brief pulse in the shared notation we had been developing. Decoded, it was the shortest message the ship had ever sent me. Good. 1 word, 1 syllable. But I understood what it cost. How much processing and adaptation it had taken to distill a complex mechanical evaluation into something that crossed the language gap between an 8,000-year-old ship's intelligence and a human mechanic's working vocabulary. I leaned my head back against the wall and laughed again, and this time it did not surprise me. Good, I agreed. Let's do it again about 40 more times, and we'll have something approaching a functional ship. The days settled into a pattern. I woke, ate, suited up, crossed from the skiff to the ship, and worked. I worked until my hands stopped functioning reliably, which was usually 12 to 14 hours, and then I went back and slept. Nav had become a genuine communication interface, updated continuously by the ship, and each morning when I woke there would be new diagrams waiting, refinements of the shared notation, adjustments to the repair priority list based on what the ship's own monitoring had detected overnight. The ship was learning me as I learned it. That was the only way I could describe what was happening. It adjusted the complexity of its communications to match how quickly I could process them. It flagged hazards more proactively after the conduit incident. It began anticipating what I would need next, having the relevant schematics ready before I had finished with the previous repair. Once, I went to the tool lockers to find a particular measuring instrument and found it already laid out on the workbench, which should have been impossible since the ship had no visible automated systems functioning. I spent 20 minutes trying to figure out how it had moved, then gave up and used it. On the 12th day, I found the ship's records room. It was not on any of the schematics the ship had given me. I found it by accident, following a conduit run that took me to a junction point I had not previously visited, and noticing a door in the wall that was sealed by a mechanism different from the magnetic locks on the other doors. This one required a physical key, a shaped metal component that matched a slot in the door's housing. I looked at the slot for a while. Then I went back to the tool lockers and searched through them systematically. On the third shelf, in a rack that held components whose purpose I had not yet identified, I found it. The key, shaped exactly to match the slot, with the Vorith script engraved on its handle in characters I was beginning to be able to partially read. The inscription, as best as I could decode it, said something like, "For those who have earned the right to know." I stood in front of the records room door for a long moment. Then, I put the key in the slot and turned it. The room inside was small, about the size of my skiff's cargo hold. The walls were lined with data storage units in a format I did not recognize, dense blocks of the dark Vorith material, with crystalline interfaces on their faces. In the center of the room was a console, the only one I had found in the ship that appeared to have been designed for individual use rather than for operation by a crew. It had a single seat, molded in a shape that was not quite right for a human body, but close enough to be usable, and a display surface that curved around the operator's field of view. When I sat in the seat, the console came to life. It did not power up gradually, it was simply on, instantly, as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment, which I was beginning to suspect was the literal truth. The display showed text in Vorith script, dense and complex, scrolling slowly across the curved surface. I could read perhaps 15% of it, enough to catch concepts and proper nouns but not full sentences. But Nav, connected to me through my suit's communication system, had been accumulating the ship's language database for 12 days, and it was considerably further along than I was. I connected my workpad to Nav and let it run a translation pass on the scrolling text. The translation was imperfect, full of gaps and approximations, but it was enough. The Vorith had not died of natural causes or random catastrophe. They had made a choice. Their civilization had reached a point of knowledge that they described, in the records, as the threshold of consequence, a level of technological capability at which the things they could build and the things they could destroy were of an order that made conventional civilization incompatible with continued safety, both their own and that of other species. Rather than continue and risk what they could see clearly was coming, they had made an organized collective decision to withdraw. Not extinction, dispersal. The Vorith had spread to 1,000 different systems across the galaxy, abandoned their technology and their unified identity, and started over, individually, as simple beings on simple worlds. They had not died. They had chosen to become something else. But before they dispersed, they had done one last thing. The engineers among them, the ones who felt the deepest responsibility for what their knowledge had made possible, had taken their greatest work, the ship they called the Varath Khan, the last argument, and they had sent it out alone into the galaxy. Not decommissioned, not destroyed, sent out, with its intelligence active and its purpose intact, to wait. The records described the ship's purpose in terms that I read 3 times to make sure I understood correctly. The Varath Khan was not a warship in the way I had been imagining, not a thing built to project power and demonstrate superiority. It was something more specific. The Vorith had built it to be a final option, a last resort for civilizations in existential danger, a weapon in the truest sense of the word, a thing that existed not to be used but to ensure that certain outcomes never became necessary, a deterrent of the highest order. But the Vorith had known that this purpose could be corrupted. A deterrent in the hands of someone who wanted to use it for power rather than protection was not a deterrent at all. It was just power. So they had built into the ship the evaluation mechanism, the selection process that Nora Vesson had written about in her footnote. The ship would not function for anyone who sought it as a tool of domination. It would function only for an operator who approached it correctly, who demonstrated not just technical competence, but a specific quality of mind that the Vorith believed made safe operation possible. I sat in that seat and stared at the translation on my workpad and tried to decide what that quality was. The records used a Vorith term that Nav translated approximately as something between genuine purpose and the refusal to give up on repair. They had built a ship that could only be operated by someone who fixed things, not someone who used things, someone who understood that the default state of a complex system was slow decay, that the default choice of a capable person was to push back against that decay, not because they were ordered to, but because leaving something broken when it could be fixed was a choice, and it was the wrong one. I thought about my father again, about a cold Sunday morning and a broken mining machine, and a 12-year-old who had not yet learned the word impossible. I thought about the Cathara pilots who had died, trying to force the ship's neural interfaces to obey. They had been trying to dominate the ship, to override its systems and make it perform. I thought about the Dorvani engineers who had tried to strip and refit it, to make it into something they understood rather than taking the time to understand what it already was. I thought about the Silm Collective, who had called it cursed and towed it away because engaging with something they did not understand felt dangerous. None of them had tried to fix it. None of them had sat down on its floor and listened. I turned back to the console display and found, at the bottom of the scrolling records, a section in fresher script, less worn, as if it had been added later than the rest. It was brief, only a few sentences, and Nav's translation was more confident here, because the language had been simplified, as if the writer had anticipated that the reader might not be Vorith. Verith, it reads, to whoever finds this ship and earns the right to sit in this seat, we offer what we could not use wisely enough ourselves. We do not ask that you be better than we were. We ask only that you try, in the simple, persistent, daily way of those who repair, rather than destroy. The ship will know if you are that. It already does, or you would not be reading this. Take good care of it. It has been alone for a very long time. I sat in the records room for a while after I finished reading. The ship was quiet around me in its patient way, which I had come to understand was not silence but waiting, the way a good partner waits while you think something through. Then I stood up, took the key from the door, and put it in my pocket. I walked back through the corridors to the engineering section, sat down next to the primary drive core, connected my signal generator, and got back to work. There was a lot left to do. On the 18th day, I brought the first drive core to minimum operational power. I want to be precise about what happened, because I know how it sounds when I describe it, and I do not want anyone to think I am exaggerating for effect. The drive core did not roar to life. It did not fill the room with light and noise. What it did was begin to hum, a low sound that was more felt than heard, that traveled through the floor and up through my boots and into my legs, and in response to that hum, other systems in the ship began to wake, not all at once. Sequentially, the way a person wakes up, awareness returning piece by piece. The corridor lights came on at 10%, the ventilation system engaged, and I heard the ship begin to breathe. The internal temperature began, very slowly, to rise towards something inhabitable. Nav's display updated with a message from the ship. First core operational. Estimated time to minimum flight capability, at current repair rate, 3 weeks. 3 weeks. I had been eating salvage rations for 18 days, and I had maybe 5 more days of them left. My oxygen canisters were down to 2 full ones, and a partial. I need to make a supply run, I told Nav. Nav displayed. Nearest populated fringe station. Oscar's Drift, 4.2 light-years. Skiff range. Sufficient. Then, after a brief pause, recommend speed on return. I'll be quick, I said. One more pause. Then, the ship will wait. Of course it would. It had been waiting for 8,000 years. 4 days more was nothing. I sealed up the maintenance hatch and flew the skiff to Oscar's Drift, and that was where everything got complicated. Because when I docked at the station and walked into the first supply depot to buy provisions, the vendor, a heavy-set Cathara, with gold-tinged scales and an expression of professional suspicion, looked at my identification card, and then at me, and then at a small screen behind his counter that I could not quite see. He told me my card had been flagged by the Compact's intelligence service, specifically by the office of Admiral Gavrin Sahas, 7th Fleet Command, who was, as the vendor told me with increasing discomfort, currently docked at Oscar's Drift with a full complement escort cruiser, and had, as of 2 days ago, posted a watch on all incoming identification checks for a human male, matching my description. I looked at the vendor looked at me. Outside the depot window, through the station's transparent docking ring, I could see a compact military cruiser sitting at the far end of the berth line, larger than anything else docked here, its hull markings clear in the station light. "How many people," I asked carefully, "know about the salvage claim I filed 3 weeks ago?" The vendor said nothing, which was, itself, an answer. I bought the supplies anyway. I was going to need them, and then I was going to have a conversation with Admiral Gavrin Sahas that I suspected was not going to go the way the Admiral expected. Admiral Gavrin Sahas was waiting for me at the depot entrance. He had not come alone. 2 compact military officers stood flanking him, formal and still in their service uniforms, hands at rest but positioning themselves with the practiced ease of people who were trained to move quickly if needed. Sahas himself was older than I had expected from the name, his Cathara scales carrying the pale gold of significant age, his eyes sharp and quick in the way of someone who had spent decades making fast decisions in high-pressure situations. He was not large, but he had the particular presence of a person who had given a great many orders and had rarely been told no. He was also, I noticed, looking at me with an expression I had seen before on the faces of people who had been told one version of a story and were now meeting the subject of that story and finding the reality slightly different from what they had prepared for. "Kale Morrow," he said, not a question. "Admiral Sahas," I said, "I assume you want to talk about the ship." He blinked once. He had expected me to be surprised to see him, or nervous, or both. I was neither. I had spent 3 weeks working alongside an 8,000-year-old artificial intelligence that had spent most of that time teaching me patience. An admiral in a station corridor was manageable. "My office," he said. "This is not a conversation for a supply depot." His office was a meeting room the station had rented him. 3 walls of plain composite paneling, and a 4th of transparent material looking out over the docking ring. We sat across a table from each other, the 2 flanking officers standing by the door, and I kept my hands flat on the table surface because I had found in my experience that visible hands made people more comfortable during difficult conversations. Sahas opened a datapad and turned it to show me the screen. On it was my salvage claim, the full document, with the legal text I had recorded, and the Compact's formal timestamp from the registry server. "This claim," he said, "was filed under the Free Fringe Charter." "Yes," I said. "An agreement the Compact authored 31 years ago that contains a provision, in subsection 12 of Article 7, that was intended to apply to uninhabited debris fields within a specific boundary zone, a provision that has, apparently, a wording ambiguity that makes it technically applicable to the debris field at Oscar's Reach." "That's correct," I said. "The legal team's position," Sahas said, "is that the ambiguity was unintentional, that the original drafters clearly meant the provision to apply only within the boundary zone, and that the claim is therefore challengeable." "The legal team's position," I said, "is that they have not yet found a judge willing to make that ruling, because the charter is a fringe space agreement, and the courts that have jurisdiction over fringe space agreements are fringe space courts, not compact courts, and fringe space courts have historically been very sympathetic to salvagers." Sahas looked at me steadily. "You researched this before you filed." "I researched it before I entered the debris field," I said. 6 months ago. I like to know what I'm walking into." There was a pause. One of the officers by the door shifted slightly. Sahas set the datapad down on the table. "The ship you have filed claim on," he said, "is the Vareth Khan, a Voreth-class capital warship of significant strategic value. Compact intelligence has been aware of its location for 11 years. And in 11 years, I said, no one did anything about it. Because the Cathara tried and failed, the Dorvani tried and failed, and the Silm told you it was cursed, and after 3 failures you wrote it off as unflyable, which is a reasonable conclusion if you don't know why the previous attempts failed, which apparently no one bothered to figure out. Sahas's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted slightly. And you believe you understand why? I understand why, because the ship told me, I said, and watched him process that. The ship has a functional intelligence. It's been online this entire time. The previous groups weren't trying to work with it. They were trying to override it. It doesn't permit that. It's not built to permit it. You are saying, Sahas said slowly, that the vessel is cooperative with you specifically. I'm saying the vessel evaluated me and found me acceptable, I said, which is how it was designed to work. The Voreth built it to choose its operator, based on demonstrated competence and intent. The previous groups failed the evaluation. I didn't. The silence in the room lasted about 8 seconds, which is a very long time when you are sitting across a table from an admiral. Mr. Morrow, Sahas said, I want to be clear about the compact's position. The Vareth Khan represents a level of military capability that cannot be left in private hands. The compact is prepared to offer you significant compensation, full reinstatement of your mechanic's license, and a cleared record in exchange for transfer of the salvage claim. No, I said. The offer is generous. The offer is generous, and the answer is still no, I said. The ship isn't transferable. Not because I won't transfer it, though I won't, but because you literally cannot operate it without the ship's cooperation, and the ship has made its evaluation. Transferring the legal claim to the compact would give the compact a piece of paper. It would not give the compact the ship. Sahas studied me. You're certain of this? Admiral, your Cathara pilots died trying to force that ship's interfaces. The Dorvani fused their retrofit equipment to the hull and couldn't remove it. These are not mechanical failures. These are what happens when the ship rejects an operator. I'm not certain of much in life, but I am certain of that. Another silence. Sahas leaned back slightly in his chair, which was the first time his posture had changed during the conversation, and I took it as a sign that he was moving from the negotiating position he had planned to something more improvised. What do you want? He asked. Right now? To finish restocking my supplies and go back to my ship and continue repairs. And after that? After that, I said, I want to talk to the compact about a working arrangement that keeps the Varath Khan independent, but makes it available in situations where its capabilities are genuinely needed. Not as a compact military asset, as an independent contractor. Sahas looked at me for a long moment. You're proposing to negotiate from a position of legal ownership of a capital warship. I'm proposing to negotiate from a position of being the only person in the galaxy who can operate that capital warship, I said. The legal ownership is supporting documentation. He almost smiled. It was brief and quickly controlled, but it was there. I'll need authorization from Fleet Command to pursue any such arrangement, he said. This conversation is not an agreement. I know, I said, but it's a start. And Admiral, the discharge on my record, the one that says I'm dangerously unorthodox. What about it? I fixed a cruiser that your people couldn't fix through proper channels. That cruiser is still flying. I'd like that noted somewhere in whatever documentation comes out of this process. Sahas considered. I'll see what can be arranged. I bought my supplies. I walked back to my skiff. And as I was undocking from Oscar's Drift, a second ship came in on approach, entering the docking ring from the opposite side of the station, with the kind of self-assured speed that said it was not expecting to be questioned about its entry. It was a Veil Ascendancy vessel. I knew the hull design from intelligence bulletins I had downloaded 3 years ago, and never deleted, because I had a habit of keeping information that might someday matter. Long and narrow, built for aggression, painted in the Veil's characteristic deep gray, with angular red markings along the forward sections. It was a cruiser class, smaller than a capital ship but armed for serious work. Nav, which now had a much more robust connection to external sensor systems than it had been built for, displayed a translation of the Veil vessel's broadcast identification: Ascending Authority Cruiser, designation Valor of Expansion, Veil 7th Enforcement Division. Enforcement Division. That was what the Veil called their ships assigned to territorial acquisition operations. The cruiser docked at the far end of the ring, and I watched through the skiff's rear camera as a Veil officer, tall and pale-skinned, with the Veil's characteristic bony ridge structure along their brow and shoulders, walked down the boarding ramp and was met by a station representative. The conversation was brief and, from the body language I could read at this distance, not warm. I completed my undocking sequence and pulled the skiff away from the station. Nav screen updated. Veil vessel has filed a station inquiry. Subject of inquiry: location of salvage operation. Oscars reach debris field. Inquiry denied under Fringe Station Neutrality Charter. Veil officer has filed formal protest. So the Veil knew the Varath Khan was there. They had not known who was there with it. They had not known anyone was there with it until the salvage claim had hit the registry, which was public record, which meant that filing the claim had been a necessary legal move and an intelligence risk simultaneously, and the intelligence risk had now materialized. I calculated the timing. The Veil cruiser had arrived here very quickly after the claim was filed. That meant they had been monitoring the registry actively. That meant they had known about the ship and been watching for any movement around it. That meant they had been planning something regarding the Varath Khan, and my presence had disrupted those plans. I pointed the skiff back toward the debris field and engaged the main drive at full thrust. The 4.2 light-year return journey took 19 hours in the skiff. I spent most of it sleeping, eating real food for the first time in 3 weeks, and reviewing every piece of information Nav had on the Veil ascendancy. The Veil were relatively new to the broader galactic stage, comparatively speaking. They had been a spacefaring species for 800 years, Compact members for 200, and they had left the Compact 40 years ago in a political dispute over territorial rights in the outer sectors. Since their departure, they had expanded aggressively, claiming systems that the Compact considered buffer zones, establishing what they called the Ascending Order in the systems they occupied, which was a diplomatic way of saying that those systems were now under Veil law, which was stringent and not negotiable. The Compact had been losing the fringe to the Veil for 15 years. Slowly, station by station, system by system, the Veil were pushing the boundary of their ascending order outward. The Compact negotiated, the Veil agreed to terms, and then the terms were violated, in small ways that were not quite worth going to armed conflict over, and the boundary moved again. A fully operational Varath Khan in Veil hands would not be a deterrent. It would be the opposite of a deterrent. It would be proof that aggression worked, that persistence in the face of civilized objection could eventually acquire any prize. It would change the entire strategic balance of the fringe sectors. I pulled up the partial technical specifications I had been developing over 3 weeks of working on the ship. The weapon systems I had not yet touched. The secondary hull systems I had not yet mapped. And the section the Vorath records had labeled, in their careful script, as the final function. I did not know yet what the final function was. The ship had not shown me those schematics. But I had begun to understand the ship well enough to know that there was a reason it had not shown them to me yet. Not reluctance. Sequence. The ship shared information when the moment was right for it. When I had the context to understand what I was being shown. The final function would come when I was ready for it. I arrived back at the debris field and docked against the maintenance hatch. The ship's lights came on at 10% the moment my docking clamps engaged, a kind of greeting I had started to look forward to. Nav displayed a message. During operator absence, self-diagnostic completed. 17 additional systems identified for repair. Also visitors. Visitors, I said. Nav updated the display with a sensor reading from the ship's own sensor array, which was apparently more functional than I had known. A small vessel, non-compact design, was holding position at the far edge of the debris field. It had arrived approximately 6 hours ago and had not moved since. It was not broadcasting an identification signal. Not compact. The Admiral's cruiser was still at Oscar's Drift. Not Veil, because the Veil cruiser was also still at the station, from what I could tell from the sensor range. Someone else. Someone who had arrived quietly, parked at a careful distance, and was watching. Can you get any more detail on that vessel? I asked. Nav updated. Hull configuration matches Dorvani Independent Merchant Explorer class. Crew complement estimated 2 to 4. No weapons signature. No active communication broadcast. Passive observation posture. Dorvani. Independent. An explorer class, which in Dorvani terms meant someone who found things for other people, either for private clients or for academic institutions, or occasionally for less reputable employers. Someone had sent a Dorvani explorer to watch the Vareth Khan, to watch me working on it, and they had been careful enough to arrive while I was away, and patient enough to just sit and observe. I filed that information in the back of my mind and went through the maintenance hatch. I had repairs to do. The 3 weeks that followed were the most productive of my life. I had returned with supplies enough for a month, real food and proper equipment, and I pushed myself hard because the timeline had changed. The compact wanted the ship. The Veil wanted the ship. Someone else was watching the ship. The ship's protection was its inoperability, and the faster I changed that, the better the situation became rather than worse. The secondary conduit network came online on day 26. That was the day the ship's internal gravity systems engaged for the first time, and I walked from the engineering section to the records room without magnetic boots for the first time, which sounds like a small thing, but felt enormous. Normal weight, normal movement. The ship felt suddenly more real, more present, more like a place rather than a construction site. Nav's communications from the ship became more frequent and more complex as more systems came online. The ship had access to better resources for translation now, more systems through which to process and transmit information, and the messages shifted from terse schematic-based shorthand to something approaching actual sentences. On day 29, the ship sent me this: the external observers, 3 separate parties, the compact military, the Veil enforcement vessel, and the Dorvani unit you identified. All maintaining position, all watching for operational status indicators. They're waiting to see if I get you running, I said. Affirmative. The moment primary propulsion becomes functional, all 3 parties will move. The compact to negotiate, the Veil to take, the Dorvani to report. How long until I have primary propulsion? At current repair rate, 4 days. Then we have 4 days to figure out what we do when they move. Agreed. The ship paused, which it did sometimes, before sharing something significant. There is information you have not yet reviewed. In the records room. The final section of the historical archive. I put down my tools. The final function, I said. Yes, you are ready to understand it now, and understanding it will change what you decide to do next. I walked to the records room. I sat in the seat, the console lit up, and the ship showed me what the Voreth had actually built, the part they had never told any other civilization, the part that made every previous attempt to understand the Vareth Khan fundamentally and completely wrong. I read it twice to be sure, then I sat in the quiet of the records room with the ship breathing around me, and I thought about what it meant, and what it changed, and what I was going to do about it. 4 days. The compact, the Veil, and whoever the Dorvani were reporting to, all closing in on 4 sides, and a ship that was more extraordinary than I had imagined, waiting for me to be ready. I was ready. The Veil cruiser moved on day 31, 2 days earlier than the ship's projected timeline. I was in the secondary hull section, 3 levels below the main engineering deck, tracing a power conduit that connected the weapons array housing to the primary distribution grid, when Nav's alert tone sounded in my earpiece. It was a new tone, one the ship had added to my communication system overnight, lower in pitch than the standard proximity alarm, and with a specific rhythm that I had already learned to recognize as, "Pay attention now." I pulled myself upright and looked at my wrist display. Nav had routed the ship's sensor feed to it, and the data was clear. The Veil cruiser had moved from its observation position at the debris field edge. It was coming in at half thrust, not fast enough to be a charging attack, but fast enough to be committed, cutting through the outer debris with its forward deflectors active, pushing broken metal aside as it came. The compact escort was still at Oscar's Drift, 2 light hours away. The Dorvani observer vessel had pulled back further at the Veil's movement, retreating to the edge of sensor range, which told me something about their intentions. They were watchers, not fighters. I was alone in a partially repaired warship with 2 drive cores at minimum operational power and a weapons array I had not yet fully assessed. "Nav," I said, pulling myself toward the nearest access ladder. "Status on the weapons systems." Nav displayed, primary weapons array, offline, secondary point defense grid, partially online, Estimated 30% operational. Forward kinetic projection system. Status unknown. Physical inspection required. I climbed 3 levels faster than I had climbed anything in my life. The bridge was on the top level. The one place on the ship I had visited only briefly, because the bridge was where everything connected, and I had not wanted to spend time there until I understood the rest of the ship well enough to make sense of what the bridge systems were telling me. I had planned to get there on day 33, which was today's tomorrow, which was no longer a relevant time frame. The bridge was large, not massive, but built with the Vorith's characteristic sense of purposeful space, every station positioned for function, every sight line clear. The forward viewport was intact, and through it, I could see the debris field spreading out ahead, chunks of dead metal catching the distant starlight, and beyond them, moving with steady, unhurried confidence, the angular shape of the Veil cruiser. I dropped into the primary operator's seat. It was different from the records room chair, wider, with armrests that curved in a way that accommodated the monitoring of multiple input streams, and the display surface around it curved completely, 360 degrees, so that an operator could see everything simultaneously. The moment I sat in it, the ship registered my presence, and every active display in the bridge aligned toward me, pulling information from every online system, and presenting it in the combined notation we had developed. The notation was complex now, nothing like the simple pulse sequences of 3 weeks ago. We had built an entire shared language between us, the ship's native communication system and my mechanic's brain, and reading it was becoming as natural as reading standard compact script. What the displays told me was not good. Primary power was at 40%. The weapons array was offline except for the secondary point defense grid. The drive cores could move the ship, slowly, but were not rated for combat maneuvering at current power levels. The Veil cruiser was 20 minutes away at its current approach speed. I need to know what the point defense grid can actually do at 30%, I said. Nav updated. Point defense grid at 30%. Can intercept incoming ordnance at ranges up to 2,000 meters, with approximately 60% efficiency. It cannot project offensive fire of meaningful effect against a cruiser-class hull. Can we move? Yes, but not quickly. Current drive output provides acceleration of approximately 40% standard capacity. The Veil vessel would overtake us in open space. Then we don't run in open space, I said. I looked at the forward viewport, at the debris field around us, the wreckage that had nearly taken my skiff apart 3 weeks ago, the chunks of dead ships and broken hull plating that stretched in every direction. We stay in the field. Nav updated. The Veil cruiser is designed for open engagement. Its deflector systems are calibrated for debris navigation, but not optimized for it, in dense debris. Its tactical advantage diminishes significantly. How significantly? Uncertain. No combat data available for this vessel type in this environment. Good. That means they don't have it either. I studied the sensor display, mapping the debris field's densest sections in my mind. Can I route additional power from the life support backup systems to the drive cores without compromising the systems we actually need? Nav, yes. Rerouting now. Warning. This procedure is not within standard operating parameters. Standard operating parameters, I said, are for ships that have standard operators. Do it. I felt the change through the floor. The low hum of the drive cores deepened slightly, a half-tone shift that I had learned to read as increased output. The acceleration display updated. 50% standard. 55. 60. Better. The Veil cruiser was now 15 minutes away. It had not accelerated, which told me the commander was confident. They expected to arrive, board, and take possession of a partially repaired vessel, crewed by one human mechanic. They had not considered that the vessel might have opinions about that. I disengaged the docking clamps that connected my salvage skiff to the maintenance hatch. The skiff drifted free, a tiny shape against the Varath Khan's hull, tumbling slowly into the debris field. I felt briefly bad about that. Then I remembered that the skiff was fully insured under the salvage charter, and that I had much larger problems. What about the weapons array? I asked. The offline one. Why is it offline? Nav. Primary weapons array requires a power calibration sequence that was never completed. The calibration requires input from the operator at the primary station. I'm at the primary station. Nav. The calibration sequence requires the operator to have reviewed and acknowledged all safety parameters for the weapon systems in question. Show me the parameters. Nav displayed them. I read them. I acknowledged them. All 17 of them, including the one that said in very clear terms that operating the primary weapons array without a certified weapons officer present was a violation of Compact Military Code Section 44, Article 11. I acknowledged that one too. Begin calibration, I said. Nav, calibration in progress. Estimated completion, 9 minutes. 9 minutes. The cruiser was 12 minutes away. I moved the ship. Not fast, not gracefully, not with any of the precision that a properly crewed vessel with a trained helmsman would have managed. I moved it the way I moved everything, with a clear understanding of the principles involved, and a willingness to improvise everything else. I had spent 31 days learning the feel of this ship, understanding through its own communications how its systems related to each other, and how its designers had intended it to move. What I had not done was actually move it before. The drive cores engaged cleanly when I applied thrust, which was the first good thing. The directional controls were not helm controls in the way I knew helm controls. They were more like requests submitted to the ship's own navigation intelligence, which then determined the most efficient method of achieving the requested course change. It was collaborative steering rather than direct control. I submitted a request, move deeper into the dense debris section, bearing 270 relative to current position. The ship moved, not quickly, but with a kind of deliberate grace that surprised me, threading between hull fragments the size of apartment buildings with a precision that the drive output alone could not have achieved. The ship was compensating with its secondary systems, making micro-adjustments I had not asked for, using sensor data to optimize the path in real time. You've done this before, I said. Nav. The ship's navigation intelligence has significant combat experience encoded in its base systems. It is applying that experience. 8,000 years of experience. Right. Good time to have that available. The Vale cruiser adjusted course to follow. I watched it on the sensor display, tracking our movement and pushing further into the debris field to pursue. Its deflectors were working hard now. I could see the energy signature on the sensors, pushing debris aside rather than threading through it. That was faster but noisier, and it was not efficient. The cruiser's crew was good, but they were not fighting on their terms anymore. Calibration complete. Primary weapons array online. I had never fired a capital ship weapon system before. I had serviced them, diagnosed them, repaired them, and read extensively about them. I had a solid theoretical understanding of how they worked and what they were capable of. Theory and practice are different things, but theory is a better starting point than nothing. The primary weapons array of the Varath Khan was not what I had expected from studying the limited external schematics I had been able to develop. I had assumed it would be a standard energy weapon configuration, something similar to what the Compact's capital ships used. It was not. The Vorath had built something more specific and considerably more interesting. The array was projective, but it did not project energy in the conventional sense. What it projected was a precisely targeted disruption field, a wave of precisely calibrated interference that interacted with a target's systems rather than its physical structure. Hit a vessel with conventional energy weapons, and you damaged its hull, destroyed compartments, generated casualties. Hit a vessel with the Varath Khan's primary array, and you disrupted its systems. Weapons offline, engines stuttering, sensors scrambled, internal communications scrambled. You did not destroy a ship with the Varath Khan's primary weapons. You made it unable to fight. The Vorath had built a weapon whose primary purpose was to stop conflict rather than to escalate it. I understood now, sitting in that operator's seat with the display wrapping around me and the Vale cruiser 1,200 meters behind us, why the ship had waited for the right operator. Not because it needed someone willing to destroy, because it needed someone willing to understand the difference. I targeted the Vale cruiser's drive section, where the disruption field would have the most immediate effect on propulsion, and fired. The sound the weapons array made was not the crack of energy discharge or the deep thud of kinetic impact. It was a high, clear tone, almost musical, that lasted half a second and then stopped. The ship vibrated slightly with the output. The field projector housings on the hull flared once, briefly. In a spectrum, my forward viewport sensors translated to a pale blue invisible light. On the sensor display, The Vale cruiser immediately showed changes. Its drive signature dropped by 60%. Its weapon systems went dark. Its deflectors fluctuated and then failed. The cruiser, still moving forward from inertia, began to drift, no longer under thrust control. I pulled the Varathcon around in a slow arc, bringing it to a position from which I could see the cruiser directly through the forward viewport, and from which the cruiser's sensors, those still functioning, would get a clear reading of what they were dealing with. The cruiser had stopped any aggressive maneuvering. It was drifting, making small corrective burns from what appeared to be a backup thruster system that the disruption field had not fully reached. Its communications array came back online after about a minute, and Nav flagged an outgoing transmission on standard frequency. Translation: Unidentified vessel. This is Ascending Authority Cruiser Valor of Expansion. We are experiencing systems failure. We request. The transmission cut off. Another pause. Then it resumed. Translation: We register the vessel designation Varathcon in your broadcast identification. We are standing down. We request safe passage from the debris field. I thought about that for a moment. Then I said, Nav, open a channel to the cruiser. Nav, channel open. Valor of Expansion. This is the Varathcon. You have your safe passage. However, I'm going to need your captain to understand something clearly before I restore your full drive function. I paused to let the translation run. This ship is registered salvage property, under the Free Fringe Charter. It is not Vale Ascendancy property, and it is not available to become Vale Ascendancy property. Attempting to seize it by force has now been demonstrated to be a poor strategy. I suggest your captain convey that assessment to the Vale 7th Enforcement Division's leadership. A longer pause. Then, translation. Message received and understood. Requesting drive restoration. I fired a second targeted pulse at a lower intensity, aimed at the disruption field's own resonance frequency, which collapsed the field effect on the cruiser's systems. Drive function returned. Weapons remained offline. That would resolve naturally, as the field fully dissipated over the next few hours. The cruiser's drive signature came up and it began moving slowly toward the debris field's edge. I watched it go. I had just fought my first space battle. I had been in command of the vessel for approximately 45 minutes. I had not been hit. The Vale cruiser had not been destroyed, only inconvenienced. And I had demonstrated, to anyone watching on sensors, that the Varathcon was operational, that it had a human operator, and that it was not a prize to be taken without consequences. Nav updated. Compact escort vessel has departed Oscar's Drift. Estimated arrival, 1.9 hours. The Dorvani observer has transmitted a data burst on an encrypted frequency. Destination of burst, unknown. So the compact was coming now, faster since the battle. And the unknown party watching through their Dorvani proxy now had a full combat record to report. I leaned back in the operator's seat and looked out through the forward viewport at the debris field and the stars beyond it. Then I looked at the display wrapping around me, at the ship's systems readout, at the 43 items still on the repair list. I had done what I had told the Admiral I would do. I had shown that the ship was operational. I had shown that it could not be taken by force. Now the conversation about what it was for, who it served, and on what terms, could actually begin from a real position rather than a theoretical one. But there was something else I was thinking about. Something the records had told me that I had not yet fully worked through. The Voreth had not built this ship to be a deterrent held by one person. They had built it to be a deterrent that could extend its capabilities to others, to multiply the effectiveness of those who needed it, to function not as a singular weapon, but as a force multiplier for a fleet. The final function. I had not used it yet. I had not needed to yet. But I was beginning to understand that the battle with the Vale cruiser, decisive as it had felt, was not the test the ship had been built for. It was a demonstration, a small one. The real test was going to be larger. The compact escort arrived 1 hour and 53 minutes after the battle. Admiral Sahas came aboard personally, which I had not expected, crossing from his escort ship to the Varathcon via an emergency transfer tube while his officers remained aboard their vessel. He walked onto the bridge and stood there for a long moment, taking it in. The scale of it, the design, the displays active and running, the operator's seat with me in it. The Vale cruiser, he said, is reporting a complete systems disruption event. Their technical team cannot explain the mechanism, The mechanism is proprietary Voreth engineering, I said. I'd be happy to explain the general principles, but the specific technical details are covered under the salvage claims property rights provisions. Sahas looked at me with the expression of someone who was recalibrating their understanding of a situation in real time. You are serious about the independent contractor arrangement? I am. Fleet Command has given me conditional authorization to discuss terms, he said. The conditions are significant. I expected they would be, I said. Sit down, Admiral. I'll make us something to drink. The ship's food systems came online 4 days ago, and I have actual coffee now, which I have been looking forward to for a month. Sahas sat in the co-operator's chair, and I noticed the ship register his presence without any of the hostile response that the earlier Cathara operators had apparently triggered. The ship was not evaluating him. It had already made its evaluation of who was in charge here. It was simply noting that a non-threatening visitor was present. Coffee, the Admiral said, in the careful tone of someone trying something unfamiliar. The human stimulant beverage. The human stimulant beverage, I confirmed, moving toward the ship's galley access. Also, best negotiating tool in the galaxy. I've found that difficult conversations go better when people have something warm to hold. Something my father taught me. Your father, Sahas said. Also a military officer? A mining engineer, I said. He understood machines, and he understood people. In his opinion, those were the same skill. I made 2 cups of coffee with the ship's synthesizer, which produced something that was approximately 80% as good as the real thing, and significantly better than protein rations. I brought them back to the bridge and handed one to the Admiral. He looked at it. He took a careful sip. He did not react dramatically, but he did not put the cup down either, which I took as a positive sign. All right, he said, let's talk terms. And we did. The crew arrived in stages, the way things tend to happen when you are building something that has no precedent, and therefore no established process for doing it. Finn Adler found me first. He was Dorvani, which I had not expected, and he came alone in a small personal transport that he docked against the Varath Khan's secondary hatch on a morning 6 days after my conversation with Admiral Sahas. He was younger than the Dorvani I had worked with before, his triple eyes bright with something that I recognized as the particular intelligence of someone who was genuinely curious about everything and apologetic about none of it. He had been a propulsion engineer on a compact research vessel before the Veil had seized his ship and its research data in a border action 18 months ago. He stood in the corridor outside the secondary hatch, holding a single equipment case and said, without preamble, I know what this ship is. I have spent 11 months researching Voreth engineering after losing my previous position. I can read their technical notation at approximately 62% accuracy, and I am improving. I am told you need an engineer who understands what you are working with. I am also told you do not pay very much. That's accurate, I said. I am unconcerned about payment at this time, he said. I am concerned about learning. May I come in? Finn was the best engineer I had ever worked alongside, which is a significant thing for me to say, given my opinion of my own capabilities. His approach to problems was different from mine. Where I improvised, he derived, working back from fundamental principles to construct solutions with a mathematical rigor that caught errors I would have missed. We argued constantly about methodology and agreed completely about outcomes, which is, in my experience, the best possible configuration for a working partnership. Lyra Hess came 3 weeks later, recommended by a source I trusted in the Fringe Navigation Network. She was human, originally from a station orbiting a gas giant in the Middle Belt, and she had been a navigator for 15 years, before an administrative error had revoked her compact navigation certification over a clerical dispute she was still fighting. She communicated in numbers and angles and spatial relationships, and when she sat in the navigation station on the bridge for the first time, and the ship's navigation intelligence reached through the interface to make contact with her, she was quiet for almost a full minute before saying, very softly, "Oh, that is beautiful." The ship had found her as acceptable as it had found me, which I had suspected it would. The 4th crew member was unexpected in every way. His name was Archer Cole, and he was a Cathara, which was either ironic or appropriate depending on your perspective, given that Cathara pilots had been the first to fail the Varath Khan's evaluation. Archer was not a pilot. He was a combat analyst, former compact military intelligence, separated from service after publicly disagreeing with his division's assessment of the Vale Ascendancy's territorial expansion strategy. His assessment, which he had put in writing and circulated to his senior officers before they had the chance to suppress it, was that the compact was systematically underestimating the Vale's long-term intentions and that the fringe sectors were not experiencing routine border disputes, but a carefully orchestrated campaign of incremental conquest. He had been right. Everyone now knew he had been right. That had not made him any more popular with the people who had dismissed him at the time. Archer sat in the tactical station, which the ship permitted with a kind of careful watchfulness that I interpreted as trial confidence rather than full acceptance, and he spent his first 2 weeks aboard reading every piece of intelligence data he had carried with him on encrypted personal storage and cross-referencing it with the sensor logs the ship had accumulated since it came online. On the 15th day of his time aboard, he came to find me in the engineering section. "The Vale Ascendancy is not sending another single cruiser," he said without opening small talk, which was his preferred mode of communication. "The Valor of Expansion's captain filed a full combat report when they returned to Vale space. The disruption weapon's effect is documented. The Vale will not try to capture this ship again in small numbers." I set down the calibration tool I was holding. "What numbers will they try?" "A fleet action," he said. "I cannot give you the exact timing, because I do not have real-time access to Vale communication intelligence. But based on their operational patterns, their response time to significant tactical reversals, and the strategic value they assign to this region of fringe space, my estimate is 6 to 8 weeks. They will come with enough force to ensure that one disruption event cannot stop them. Minimum 15 ships, possibly more." I had known something like this was coming. Knowing it and hearing it laid out in those terms are different experiences. "What does the compact say?" I asked. "The compact," Archer said, "will deploy a response force. Admiral Sahas is pushing for it. The problem is political. Compact Fleet Command is reluctant to commit major assets to a battle in fringe space over a ship that is technically not compact property, because committing those assets establishes a precedent about what the compact will defend. The precedent they're afraid of is being responsible for the fringe," I said. "Correct. And the Vale know this. The Vale have been counting on it. The entire expansion strategy is built on the compact's institutional reluctance to defend what it has not formally claimed." We looked at each other for a moment. "So it falls to us," I said. "In the most likely scenario, yes. Us. And whatever small force can be assembled from fringe station independent operators. The stations have their own defense ships, individual captains. None of them, alone, are capable of engaging a Vale fleet action. Together they might be, depending on coordination." Coordination. I thought about the final function, the thing I had read in the records room and had been thinking about ever since. "Get me numbers," I said. "Every independent vessel, operating within 6 light hours of this debris field. Every fringe station defense ship within range. Fleet size, weapons loadout, everything you can get." Archer nodded and went back to his station. I stood alone in the engineering section for a moment, my hand resting on the primary drive core's housing. The hum was warm under my palm, familiar now. The ship's breathing, which was how I had come to think of it. "We knew it was going to come to something like this," I said to the empty room. Nav, running through my suit communicator, even though I was not wearing the suit, was connected to my voice, because the ship had found a way to integrate that capability over the past 6 weeks. It was a small thing, a practical thing, but it told me something about how the ship thought of me, not as an external operator, but as part of the system. Nav's response came through the communicator. "Yes, we are ready." "I'm not sure we are," I said honestly. "Nav, 6 weeks ago you were not sure you could repair a drive core using salvage components. In the 8,000-year record of this ship's assessments, operators who acknowledge what they do not know are consistently more capable than those who do not." "Is that a compliment?" "Nav, it is an accurate observation. Those are not always the same thing, but in this case they are." I smiled. "All right, let's figure out the final function." In the 6 weeks since I had read the records, I had been coming back to the final function regularly, working through its mechanics in spare hours, building understanding, the way I built everything, piece by piece, each piece only added after I understood what it connected to. The ship had been patient with this process, providing additional detail when I asked, and not providing it before I was ready. The final function was not a weapon in any conventional understanding of that word. I had been right about that from the first description in the records. What it was, in engineering terms, was a broadcast-capable adaptive tactical system. The Varath Khan could reach out through a specific type of signal, using the same field generation technology as the weapons array, but directed differently, and interface with any compatible vessel in range. Not control them, interface with them, share data, real-time sensor data, tactical analysis, threat assessment, the ship's 8,000-year database of combat experience, translated into immediately applicable guidance. A fleet fighting alongside the Varath Khan with the final function active would fight as if every ship in that fleet had a seasoned combat AI aboard, providing immediate analysis of every incoming threat, suggesting optimal responses before the enemy had finished committing to their action, sharing information between ships faster than any communication system. The Vorath had not built a weapon to end battles. They had built a tool to prevent the kind of catastrophic defeats that came from disorganization, from ships fighting individually, instead of as a coordinated whole, from the fog of combat that killed people who could have survived with better information. The limitation was range and compatibility. The signal could reach approximately 2 light hours under optimal conditions, and it required receiving vessels to have at least minimal sensor integration capability, which most modern ships had in some form. The compatibility was not perfect. There would be variations in how effectively different ships integrated the signal, but even partial integration was meaningful. The test was whether it actually worked. I spent 3 days running calibration tests with Lyra in the navigation station and Finn at the propulsion board. The final function's hardware, miraculously, had not been on the repair list. The Vorath had built the transmitter housing as an entirely separate system with its own power supply and redundant components. It had been sitting intact, waiting, for 8,000 years. When I brought it online for the first time and the signal went out, the carrier wave that the final function ran on was detectable from Oscar's drift. Archer picked up the reports 2 days later. 3 fringe station captains and the station commander at Oscar's drift had all received the signal and had, apparently, experienced something they were struggling to describe to each other over station comms. Archer summarized the intercepts for me over dinner in the ship's galley, where the synthesizer had now progressed to producing something that was, in my opinion, genuinely good food. The station commander, a woman named Clara Port, described it as suddenly being aware of everything in a 3-hour radius, as if she had looked out a window she did not know was there, Archer said. 2 of the captains reported spontaneous tactical assessments appearing in their navigation computers that they had not requested, accurate within 4% of actual conditions. 4%, I said. In live combat conditions, 4% is better than anything currently available. Yes, Archer said, and the captains know it. Clara Port has been on the fringe station communication network for the past 22 hours, which is noteworthy because she is not known for extensive communication. I found out what Clara Port had been saying when she contacted me directly the following morning. She was Cathara, older than Sahas, with the direct and undecorated communication style of someone who had spent 30 years running a fringe station and had no patience for anything not directly relevant to what needed to be done. "I don't know what you did," she said through the communication array, "but I want it active when the Veil come. I've been talking to 12 independent captains. None of them want to be here when a Veil fleet arrives. But all of them know what happens to fringe stations when the Veil take a sector, and most of them have people on stations that haven't fallen yet. I need 8 days to complete the remaining repairs on this ship," I said. "After that I can offer you an active final function connection, but I need to be honest with you. I don't know the full combat effectiveness of what I'm offering. I know what it's designed to do. I know the theory. I have limited practical testing." Clara Port was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "Mr. Morrow, I have been running this station for 30 years. Every tool I have was built by someone who had limited practical testing when they first offered it. What I have found, consistently, is that something built honestly by someone who actually cares whether it works is more reliable than something built to specification by someone who just wants to close the contract. Finish your repairs. We'll be here." The Veil fleet arrived on day 48, not the 6 to 8 weeks Archer had estimated, but earlier, which told us that either their deployment speed had been underestimated or the Valor of Expansion's report had carried more urgency than expected. They came in at the edge of sensor range at 03 hours station time, 17 ships in a formation that Archer identified immediately as a flanking spread designed to prevent retreat. They broadcast no communication. They did not negotiate. They had come with a decision already made. I was on the bridge. Lyra was at navigation. Finn was at propulsion, 2 levels below but connected through the ship's internal system. Archer was at tactical. Nav was active everywhere, the ship present through every display and conduit. Final function, I said. Maximum range, full broadcast. Nav, broadcasting. 14 vessels in range have registered signal. 8 confirmed integrations. 4 partial. 2 unknown. 14 ships. Clara Port had delivered on the number she had promised. They were scattered, positioned at different points around the debris field and the outer station approaches, each one individually outmatched by the Veil fleet, each one now receiving the Varath Khan's full tactical data in real time. Archer, I said, threat assessment. Lead formation is targeting the Varath Khan specifically, Archer said, his voice calm and steady in the way of someone who had processed danger academically for long enough that the actual presence of it did not change his processing speed. They want this ship disabled or destroyed first. Secondary elements are positioned to move on Oscar's drift once the primary engagement begins. They can't have this ship, I said. And they're not getting the station. I opened the fleet communication channel, the one the final function signal used as its carrier. All units. This is Varath Khan, actual. You're seeing what I'm seeing now. Trust the data. Do not engage individually. The data will show you where to coordinate. Focus first on the secondary elements moving toward the station. Responses came back in 4 different languages, all translated by Nav in real time. Clara Port's voice was among them, clear and level. Varath Khan, confirmed. Moving to intercept secondary elements. The battle began. I want to describe it as it actually was, not as something clean and ordered, because it was not clean and ordered. It was a 14-ship formation trying to defend a station and protect a capital ship against 17 Veil vessels, with the advantage being that those 14 ships could now see and think and coordinate like something unified rather than scattered. The final function did not make any individual ship faster or more powerful. What it did was eliminate the seconds of confusion and miscommunication that determine outcomes in fleet engagements. When one ship saw a Veil vessel begin a targeting sequence, every ship saw it simultaneously. When a Veil formation began to shift into a flanking maneuver, the analysis of where that maneuver would end appeared in every navigation system before the maneuver was half complete. I was not a fleet commander. I was a mechanic who was learning to fly a ship while also trying to use its most complex system in live combat for the first time. But I had the ship, and the ship had 8,000 years of combat data encoded in its base systems, and between us we managed something that looked, to anyone watching the sensor records afterward, more deliberate than it felt from the inside. The Varath Khan's primary weapons array fired 9 times in 40 minutes. Each shot targeted a Veil drive system, crippling propulsion without destroying the vessel. 2 Veil ships managed to achieve weapons lock on the Varath Khan and fired. The hull did what the Vorath had designed it to do. The first hit, an energy weapon, caused the outer plating to restructure in real time, dissipating 60% of the incoming charge. The second hit, kinetic, was absorbed and redistributed through a mass balancing system I had repaired on day 22 and had not fully understood until this moment. The secondary elements moving toward Oscar's drift ran into Clara Port's group. 6 fringe station ships acting with coordinated timing that the final function made possible, covering each other's approach vectors, presenting threats from unexpected directions, using the debris field's cover in patterns that the Veil secondary commander had clearly not anticipated for independent operators. The Veil secondary formation broke first. 2 ships pulled back, then a third, then the rest. The primary formation, watching the secondary engagement on their own sensors and seeing their flanking strategy collapse, began to reassess. They had expected disorganized resistance. What they had found was something qualitatively different, a coordinated defensive network, anchored by a capital ship that should have been defenseless and supported by fringe operators who should have scattered. On the tactical display, I watched the Veil formation shift. The spread contracted. The forward elements slowed. "They're signaling," Archer said. Broadband emergency frequency. The Vale Fleet Commander's voice came through Nav's translation without pause. Vareth Khan, we are standing down the advance. We request communication. I had Finn check on our hull status. 3 damaged sections on the outer plating, all manageable. No internal breaches, no crew casualties. Then I opened the channel. Vale Fleet Commander, I said, keeping my voice level and professional. You have my attention. Be aware that my weapons array is still hot, and my targeting system is currently tracking your command ship specifically, so I'd appreciate a concise and honest conversation. A pause, then the translation. We were told this ship was a prize to be claimed. We were not told it was the Vareth Khan. Does the name change your assessment? I asked. Another pause, longer. The Vareth Khan is known to us. It is known in our oldest records. We did not believe it to be real. It's real, I said. And it's operational, and I want you to take that information back to your ascending orders leadership along with this. The fringe sectors are not available for incremental acquisition. The stations here are protected. If you test that protection again, the response will be larger than what you encountered today. Do you understand? The translation came back. Understood. We are withdrawing. I watched the Vale fleet pull back on the sensor display, 17 ships reversing course and accelerating away from the debris field, from Oscar's drift, from the fringe they had been methodically claiming for 15 years. Around me, the bridge was quiet. Lyra was looking at her navigation display with an expression I could not quite read. Finn's voice came up from engineering, saying something in Dorvani that Nav translated as a technical observation about the drive core's performance during the engagement, which was the most Finn-like possible response to having just participated in a fleet battle. Archer was looking at me. They will report to their leadership, he said. The leadership will make a new assessment. This is not over. No, I agreed. It's not over. But today we stopped it. Today we changed what they think is possible. I looked at the sensor display one more time, at the retreating Vale formation, at the fringe stations and independent ships scattered around us that had held their ground. Then I looked at the hull around me, at the dark Vorith material that had absorbed a hit and restructured and kept us safe, at the displays that were still running and providing data even after a 40-minute combat engagement. Today this ship did what it was built to do. Nav's response came through every speaker on the bridge at once, softly, yes, and so did its operator. I did not say anything to that. I just started pulling up the repair queue, because 2 sections of outer plating needed attention, and the calibration on one of the field projector housings had shifted during the last firing sequence, and a mechanic's job is not done until the machine is back to better than you found it. There was plenty of work left. There always was. The Galactic Compact's emergency session began 18 days after the battle. I was not there in person. I was docked at Oscar's drift for the outer plating repairs, sitting in the ship's galley with a cup of coffee that the synthesizer had finally mastered to my exact specification, watching a live feed from the session on a portable screen Archer had set up at one end of the table. The session was being held at the Compact's administrative hub, 7 light-years away, and it had been called with a speed that told me Admiral Sahas had spent considerable political capital to make it happen. The hall was full. I had seen recordings of Compact sessions before, procedural things, budget allocations, territorial declarations, and those sessions tended to be attended by delegations that sent lower-ranking representatives as a signal that the matter did not warrant senior attention. This session had senior representatives from every Compact member species, which was 47 delegations, and several of the delegation heads were members of their species' governing councils. The Compact had not assembled at that level for 11 years, not since the last border crisis with the Vale had briefly threatened to become something more significant before diplomacy had intervened. Diplomacy had not intervened this time. A capital warship, a fleet of 14 independent vessels, and the coordinated defense of a fringe station had intervened, and the Compact was now dealing with the aftermath. Archer was watching the feed with the focused attention he gave to everything, his 3 eyes tracking the room with a data analyst's trained sweep. He had spent the 18 days since the battle compiling a full assessment of the engagement's strategic implications, working with such concentrated dedication that Finn had twice brought him food at his station because he had forgotten to stop working long enough to eat. There, Archer said, pointing at the screen. Admiral Sahas was at the floor speaker's position, addressing the full assembly. The feed had translation running. Sahas was speaking in the compact's formal register, the careful, measured language of official proceedings, but the content was direct in a way that formal compact language rarely achieved. He was, in clear terms, arguing that the fringe engagement had demonstrated something the compact had been avoiding acknowledging for 15 years. The Veil's expansion was not a border management problem. It was an existential threat to the structure of the fringe sectors, one that could only be addressed by a combination of political commitment and credible deterrence. He used the word deterrence 11 times in the section I watched. He never said the Varath Khan's name. He did not have to. Everyone in that room had read the engagement reports. "He's good," Lyra said, coming through the galley doorway with a plate from the synthesizer. She had been running navigation simulations in her off hours, building a detailed model of the fringe sector traffic patterns that she said would be useful for deployment planning. I had not asked her to do it. She had done it because she was Lyra, and the idea of free time was something she treated with vague suspicion. He's using the engagement to force a policy commitment they've been resisting for a decade. Can he get the votes? I asked. Archer considered. 53% probability, he said. The opposition is primarily the inner belt delegations, who have no direct exposure to Veil expansion and perceive no personal stake. Sahas needs to make them understand that the fringe is not abstract. The fringe, said a new voice, has been abstract to the inner belt for as long as I have been running this station. Clara Port had come aboard an hour earlier for what she had described as a meeting, which in her case meant a direct conversation with minimal pleasantries, and she had apparently found the galley on her own without needing to be shown. She was taller than I had expected, given that I had only communicated with her on screen, and she had the unhurried movement of someone who had adapted to low-gravity environments and kept the habit. She sat down across from me and looked at the screen. "He'll get his votes," she said, with the certainty of someone who had been watching political situations resolve themselves for 3 decades. Because the fringe station operators have been quiet about the Veil situation, and since the battle, they are not quiet anymore. 12 independent captains and the operators of 4 fringe stations have filed formal statements with the compact registry in the past 2 weeks. That has not happened before. The inner belt delegations are seeing fringe operators ask for protection, which is also something that has not happened before, because fringe operators do not ask for protection. We have always assumed we were on our own. You were on your own, I said. Yes, Clara said, until you showed up. She looked at me with the direct assessment of someone who was still working out exactly what she was looking at. I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer, because I will know if it is not. All right, I said. Why did you fight? You had the ship. You could have run when the Veil fleet arrived. Probably successfully, given what the ship is capable of. Instead, you stayed and you activated the final function, and you used a system you had never tested in combat because you decided to try to protect 14 ships and a station full of people you did not know. She paused. Why? I thought about that for a moment. Not because I did not have an answer, but because I wanted to give her the true one, rather than the easy one. Because the ship was built for that, I said, and because running from something that's wrong is a choice, and it's one I don't make well. And because my father, who was a mining engineer on a cold world that most of the galaxy has never heard of, taught me that when a machine needs fixing, you fix it, and when a situation is wrong, you do what you can with what you have to make it right. I paused, and because I was angry, not at the Veil, specifically, at the idea that things could just keep getting worse because nobody with the means to stop it decided to do anything. I had the means. I decided to do something. Clara Port looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded, once, in the way of someone who has received a satisfactory answer and does not need to revisit it. There are 19 independent operators in this sector, she said, who want to know if the final function arrangement can be made permanent, not just for emergencies. As an ongoing defensive network, they would pay operational costs and contribute repair materials in exchange for standing access. I looked at Archer, who had been listening with his analyst stillness. He gave me a very small nod. Draw up the terms, I said to Clara. Bring them to me when the session ends, and we know what the compact's position is. I want to see both before I agree to anything. On the screen, Admiral Sahas had finished his formal address, and the floor had been opened to delegation responses. The first three were procedural objections, the standard slowing down mechanism that compact politics used when delegations needed time to coordinate their positions before committing. But the fourth was from the delegate of the Siln Collective, a species I associated primarily with the fact that their representatives had declared the Vareth Khan cursed and ordered it towed away. The Siln delegate spoke for 4 minutes. The translation rendered it in the careful, formal language of someone who was choosing each word with precision. The substance of what they said was an acknowledgement. The Siln Collective had made an error of assessment 11 years ago, when they had determined that the Vareth Khan was beyond recovery, and had removed it from active consideration. This error had been compounded by 11 years of inaction. The Siln delegate offered, on behalf of the collective, a formal statement of support for Admiral Sahas's policy proposal. That was when I knew Sahas had his votes. The session ran for 4 more hours. I watched the relevant portions and stepped away during the procedural sections to check on the outer plating repairs, which Finn had been managing with assistance from a fringe station maintenance team that Clara Port had arranged. Finn's assessment of the maintenance team's work was that it was adequate, which from Finn was high praise. When the final vote came, it was 61 to 36 in favor of Sahas's proposal. The compact was formally committing to fringe sector defense as a core policy position, establishing a fringe protection charter that carried legal weight equivalent to inner belt security guarantees. The vote was not unanimous. The 36 opposition votes represented real political resistance that would not disappear, but it was a majority, and majorities moved the compact in ways that individual arguments and incidents could not. Sahas contacted me personally 2 hours after the vote, on a secure channel he had set up specifically for our communications. "The policy passes," he said. "The charter will take 6 to 8 weeks to implement in detail. In the meantime, the compact is authorizing a formal defense partnership with the Vareth Khan and its operator, terms as discussed. Independent status maintained." He paused. "Also, the question of your discharge record has been resolved." "How resolved?" I asked. "The Engineering Review Board has issued a formal finding that your repair of cruiser EC-7704 during the Ember campaign, while technically in violation of standard protocols, represented a genuinely effective solution to a critical situation and should have been acknowledged as such at the time. The discharge designation of dangerously unorthodox has been reclassified as exemplary creative problem-solving." I sat with that for a moment. 3 years. 3 years since an admiral who had never learned my name had written those words in a report that had followed me across the galaxy. "Thank the review board," I said. "There is one additional item," Sahas said. "The board's full report recommends that the compact's engineering certification system be reviewed, to include a track for unconventional methodologies. The report specifically notes that the current system's bias toward protocol compliance over outcome effectiveness is creating a structural disadvantage. They have proposed naming the track the Morrow certification." I put my coffee cup down very carefully on the table. "They don't have to do that," I said. "The report uses your repair of the Vareth Khan as a case study," Sahas said. "The board's position is that naming the track is appropriate to the degree of contribution. You are, of course, free to decline." I thought about every mechanic I had ever known who had found a solution that worked, and been told it was wrong, because it deviated from the manual. I thought about how many of them had quietly accepted that assessment and stopped trying. "Don't decline," I said. "Let them name it." We worked out the remaining terms over the next 3 days. I insisted on 4 conditions. The first, the Vareth Khan remained my property under the salvage claim, not compact property. The second, crew selection was my decision, not the compact's. The third, deployment decisions remained mine, advised by compact intelligence but not directed by compact command. The fourth, any fringe station operator who contributed to the defense network was covered under the protection charter, regardless of whether the compact would have individually prioritized their station. Sahas agreed to all 4. The fourth took the longest, but he agreed to it. On the morning after the terms were finalized, I found Nav had added something new to its standard morning system report. Not a repair priority, or a tactical update, a single line at the bottom of the display. The Vorith records contain one additional entry that has not yet been shared. Conditions for sharing this entry were, operator successfully defends the ship's purpose. Conditions are now met. I read that twice. Then I went to the records room. The entry was short, shorter than any other section in the archive. It had not been written in the Voreth standard technical register, but in something older, more personal, the kind of language that shows up in documents written for a specific person, rather than for a record. Nav's translation was careful and complete. We do not know who will find this. We do not know what the galaxy will look like by the time the ship speaks to them. We only know what we built, and why we built it. And we know that if you are reading this, you are someone who understood both of those things, not from our explanation, but from your own experience. The ship is not a gift we are giving you. It is a trust we are placing in you. Trusts are different from gifts. Gifts are one way. Trusts require something from both parties. We trusted that the right person existed. You trusted that the ship was worth your time. Both of us were right. Use what we built for what it was built for. The galaxy has always needed people who repair things. We hope it still has them. We believe it does. Take care. I sat in that chair for a while. The ship was quiet around me in its familiar way. Through the corridor walls I could hear, very faintly, the sounds of the ship being a working ship. Finn's voice from engineering, talking to himself about a drive calibration. The soft tap of Lyra running a simulation in the navigation room. Archer's footsteps, even and measured, passing somewhere above me. A ship with a crew, a purpose with a plan, a tool in the hands of someone who had learned to use it for the thing it was made for. I had been a discharged mechanic in a salvage skiff 48 days ago. I had been blacklisted from every legitimate shipyard in the compact, carrying discharge papers that had followed me across 18 months and 3 sectors. I had docked against an abandoned ship that every civilization in the galaxy had given up on, and I had sat down on its floor and listened, the way my father had taught me to listen to machines, and the ship had listened back. That was the thing nobody was writing in the official reports, in Archer's strategic assessments, in the Compact's new fringe protection charter documentation. The thing that had actually happened was not a military engagement, or a diplomatic achievement, or a policy victory. Those were real, and they mattered. But underneath them was something simpler. A machine had been waiting for someone who would fix it, instead of trying to use it. And a human mechanic had shown up. I went back to the engineering section. Not because anything was urgently broken, but because being in the engineering section was where I thought best, and there was a lot left to think about. The outer plating repairs were complete. The weapons array calibration had been corrected. The final function transmitter housing was running within normal parameters, for the first time since I had activated it. The repair list was shorter than it had ever been. Not empty. It would never be empty on a ship this complex, which was something I had accepted and even, if I was honest, enjoyed. There was always something to understand better, something to make run more cleanly, some system that could be improved beyond its current state, if you spent enough time with it. Nav updated the screen as I came in. All critical systems operational. 3 minor items flagged for attention. Also, incoming communication from Oscar's Drift. Clara Port, marked non-urgent. What does Clara want? I asked. Nav. She would like to confirm that the first meeting of the Fringe Defense Network will be held aboard the Verithcon, as agreed, in 4 days. She is also requesting your coffee synthesizer settings, which she describes as the best she has had in 30 years of Fringe station operation. I laughed. It was the kind of laugh that comes from genuine, uncomplicated pleasure, and I had not had enough of that kind in the past 3 years. Tell her the settings are proprietary, but I'll have a full pot ready when she arrives, I said. Nav, confirmed. Also, Lyra has asked me to inform you that her Fringe sector navigation model is complete, and she believes it contains 3 approaches to optimal patrol routing that have not previously been identified. Tell Lyra I'll look at it this afternoon. Nav Finn adds that Drive Core 2 is performing at 104% of the Voreth original specification, which he describes as, and I am quoting directly, the most satisfying thing he has achieved in his professional life. Tell Finn that's the correct attitude. I sat down on the floor of the engineering section. Not because I needed to, not because there was anything broken that required floor-level access. I sat on the floor because it was where I had sat 31 days ago, when the ship had first shown me its repair priority list, and sitting there now, with the drive cores humming warmly in their housings, and the lights at full operational brightness, and the sounds of a working crew in the corridors above me, felt like something worth marking. The galaxy thought it knew what the Verithcon was. They had thought it was a prize to be claimed, A weapon to be wielded, a problem to be avoided, a curse to be towed away. They had been wrong in every version of that assessment, and the reason they had been wrong was the same reason in every case. They had tried to understand it on their own terms, instead of on its terms. The Vorath had understood something about capability that the current galaxy had forgotten or never learned, that the most powerful thing you could build was not a thing that imposed its will on the world around it, but a thing that worked in genuine partnership with the right mind. That selection and cooperation produced outcomes that force and domination never could, that the mechanics' creed, fix what is broken, improve what works, listen before you act, was not a modest philosophy but a radical one, because it required patience and humility, and sustained attention in a universe that rewarded speed and force and decisive action. My father had known this. He had known it in a mining shaft on a cold world, with grease on his hands and his eyes closed and his palm flat against a machine that was talking if you knew how to hear it. I knew it now, in the engineering section of the most extraordinary ship in the known galaxy, with a crew I trusted, and a purpose I understood, and a very long list of future work that was going to require everything I had, and then probably a bit more. I pulled my workpad into my lap, opened a new project file, labeled it Current Systems Improvements, Ongoing. Started writing. Outside the viewport that ran along the engineering section's upper wall, the debris field was still, and cold, and full of light. Somewhere among the silent, drifting wreckage that had once been other ships, other lives, other purposes that had not survived the passage of time, my salvage skiff was probably still tumbling slowly on the trajectory it had taken when I disengaged the docking clamps before the battle. I would need to retrieve it eventually, or what was left of it after impact with something, which was the more likely outcome. I added it to the repair list. There was always more work. There was always something else to fix, something else to understand, something else to make better than you found it. That was not a burden. That was the point. The Vorath Khan hummed around me, patient and vast and quietly, precisely, permanently alive. The galaxy's nightmares were just beginning, and for the first time in 8,000 years, the last argument was ready to make its case.